We have reason to believe the Russian forces are planning to and intend to attack Ukraine in the coming week, in the coming days. We believe that they will target Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million innocent people.
The ominous words overnight of the American president, somehow they still don't ring true in this city of Kyiv, where children play on World War II tanks in front of the Lady in Grey, the great motherland monument once put up by the Soviet Union to celebrate a unity long reduced to distant memory. Will President Putin really order the invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of one of the great capitals of Europe? It sounds implausible, a likely massacre resulting perhaps in his own political suicide. But that is the worst case scenario they're trying to prevent here at the annual Munich Security Conference. Mr. Putin, who failed to show up, has certainly achieved one thing: breathe new life into NATO and so much unity into the West that they might as well finish each other's sentences.
Let me be clear. I can say with absolute certainty, if Russia further invades Ukraine,
eine militärische Aggression gegen die Ukraine wäre ein schwerer Fehler.
Because the events of these days could reshape the entire international order.
Take note, Moscow, even China joined in.
First of all, let me reiterate that the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of any country should be respected and safeguarded.
The Prime Minister clearly relished the chance to talk geopolitics, not parties, with the man who perhaps appreciates him most in the world today, the President of Ukraine, who left his besieged homeland to come to Munich.
This is a very dangerous moment in our history. We stand on the brink of what could be a war in Europe. I think it would be an absolute disaster, be a disaster for Europe, a disaster for Ukraine, and a disaster certainly for Russia.
Meanwhile, at a much smaller conference, President Putin and his friend President Lukashenko of Belarus watched the spectacular finale of their joint military exercises, Russian ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warhead. So far, only the rhetoric is going nuclear, but the memo to planet Earth is this: we do need to get serious about nukes. Nerves also fraught in Ukraine itself, even on TV talk shows. The guy getting punched was a pro-Russian politician. The ex-president that we interviewed yesterday sauntered over in despair. The scrum an unseemly insight into the entrails of Ukrainian democracy. Words have been weaponized in this crisis with human consequences. These were civilians in eastern Ukraine today, told to flee a supposed attack from the Kiev government, which the Ukrainians flatly deny. So is this exodus really necessary? Most people are staying put. And yet the potential for tragedy here is immense, the window for avoiding it shrinking fast. Well, there were indeed some eyebrows raised here by why Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, bothered to go all the way to Munich and leave the capital in these rather difficult times. Now, judging from his speech, he was very keen to eyeball his fellow leaders and tell them to their face that it is also their fault, that it is the West's fault that Ukraine finds itself in such a vulnerable position. He accused them of appeasement 8 years ago when the Maidan protests took place, leading to the pro-Russian president here leaving, and then, of course, directly to the occupation of Crimea and much of Donbass in eastern Ukraine. At home, by the way, his approval ratings are dismal and plummeting, and he's presumably trying to shore up his own domestic credentials. The conversations about security in Europe are finally taking place, but with Russia holding a gun to Ukraine's head, it is an astonishing test of wills, a power struggle involving a toxic mixture of grand ideas, vital interests, a lot of history, domestic polities, and, as you just saw in my piece, plenty of armies and missiles. An old-school great game with potentially deadly consequences in the 21st century. Kathy.
Matt, thanks very much. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, who's chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee and is at the summit in Munich. I asked him how he would describe the gravity of the situation in Ukraine.
The prospect of war in Europe is very, very real indeed. We're seeing Russia following its very familiar playbook and developing its false narratives to provoke Ukraine into conflict. But I have to say there are some difficult questions being asked here at the Munich Security Conference, given the imminence of an invasion, as to why the might of NATO, the most powerful military alliance in history, does not have the ability to prevent a European democracy from being invaded. And the short answer is that we've hidden behind the fact that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So we're sort of exempting ourselves from that responsibility.
Well, having seen Russia test fire its nuclear-capable missiles today, do you not think sending troops to Ukraine, even if they were to ask, obviously, do you not think that would inflame the situation, could lead to some kind of nuclear confrontation?
Yeah, no, the moment's gone. Let's make it clear. We didn't have the foresight, the situational awareness 6 months ago to recognize where this was heading. I called for a division to move there to Ukraine, and that would have made Putin think twice.
But when you look at that firepower on display from Russia today, wouldn't it have been folly to try and, you could be risking some kind of awful nuclear confrontation if you had done what you suggested months ago? At that point, you could have triggered something worse.
Right, and then we're back in 1938 territory, aren't we? Where we kowtow to our adversary because we don't stand up for what we believe in. Maybe we're haunted by Afghanistan and Iraq, understandably, but those is where we chose to invade a country. What we're doing here is coming to the support of a European democracy to prevent an invasion. And I can assure you that had a NATO division gone in there with a number of countries from across the West, Putin would have thought twice about triggering something much, much more unstable and confrontation with the West.
If an invasion does happen, there is the risk of millions of people being displaced from Ukraine. Given that the government hasn't fulfilled its promises to all those refugees from Afghanistan, thousands of whom are still living in hotels, do you have any confidence that Boris Johnson's government will welcome Ukrainians who have been displaced?
There will be an insurgency that will develop inside Ukraine, depending on how far Russia will advance in its attack. How are we going to support that insurgency? Is there going to be a government in exile? How are we going to provide the assistance to make sure that Russia will feel so uncomfortable here that it will not be in their interest to stay for very long at all if they do invade? There are so many questions that need to be worked through. It does require, as I reiterate, the leaders from the key nations, from Germany, from France, from Britain and the United States to get together. I've said this before, it's almost like we need another Casablanca conference. We've forgotten what the West stands for, what we believe in, what we're willing to defend. We've forgotten what's written on the tin of NATO, which is European security. This is all now coming to the fore.